Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to part three, the final part of C.S. Lewis's favorite books. I did the books in order, and I maybe almost should have done this one first. Let me know what you think, but they all fit together. This is Phantastes, and I'm going to start not by telling you anything about George MacDonald or Phantastes. I'm going to start with something that happened this past week. Um, I'm going to read a little bit from Memoria Press's Famous Men of the Middle Ages. And we just encountered this story, and my daughter had something impressive to say about it that I think is exactly what George MacDonald and C.S. Lewis are talking about. Here's Siegfried killing a dragon in Germanic folklore. Far over the sea from sunny Burgundy lived Brunhilde, Queen of Iceland. Fair was she of face and strong beyond compare. If a knight would woo and win her, he must surpass her in three contests, leaping, hurling the spear, and pitching the stone. If he failed in even one, he must forfeit his life. And my 8-year-old said, "Oh, that's like Atalanta," because she knew the Greek story of Atalanta, who was raised by a bear and then returns to her father king, and he wants to keep so tight hold of her that he says no one can marry her unless he defeats her in a foot race first. And if you lose the race, you lose your life. And there are already 12 heads on the city wall from princes who have tried to win the fair Atalanta. But the hero Melampion is favored by the gods with 3 golden apples, and he knows he can use these to defeat Atalanta in the foot race. And he starts running. She even gives him a head start. He starts running, and as she starts to catch up, he throws one of the apples beside the road, and she turns aside. She cannot resist this golden apple. She's definitely a daughter of Eve. And runs ahead again. She finally starts to catch up. He throws the next apple a little bit further, and she darts off to get hold of this one. And here they are in a lovely kind of a early 20th century illustration. Look how daintily she picks up that apple. And the third time is near the finish line, and he just hurls it as far as he can. And she thinks, "Well, I'm in this far." And she goes to get this apple. By the time she comes back, he has won. And I was proud of Clara for remembering stories so that when we read about King Gunther defeating Brunhilde in leaping, hurling the spear, and throwing the stone, she just said, "Oh, that's like Atalanta." And then she said, I said, "Isn't it amazing that those two cultures did not talk to each other? They were too far away. They never met each other. These people never read the story of Atalanta." And she thought about it for a second and she said, "Oh, well, it should be a story if two people thought of it." George MacDonald has written a book based on the idea that Fairyland should be a story. It's not just a story we accidentally have, it actually should. I want to know more about what my daughter means by it should be a story. But I also don't know how to get her to explain it because she's the one who has this childlike insight on it, and I'm the one who has forgotten why some things should be stories. Well, here's George MacDonald, who lived from 1824 to 1905. C.S. Lewis just missed him. Phantastes is the book that a 16-year-old C.S. Lewis bought in a bookshop while he was waiting for a train one day. And as he read this book, he forgot he was reading. He sat and read it as if he was inside the book. And he later said, it was then that he first began to understand Christianity. Because, as you know, he was an atheist in his early years. So here's this story. Uh, Phantastes is a short, it's a novella. It is about a man named Anodos who enters fairyland and then stops believing in it. What a twist. Most people stop with the twist of finding fairyland. He finds it and then stops believing that's what he's looking at. He starts with opening his father's old desk and opening all the drawers and going through all the papers and learning about his family heritage. But in a cabinet he hasn't opened before, he finds this fairy woman. Here's what it says. Listen to George MacDonald's writing style. Suddenly there stood on the threshold of the little chamber, as though she had just emerged from its depth, a tiny woman form, as perfect in shape as if she had been a small Greek statuette, roused to life and motion. Her dress was of a kind that could never grow old-fashioned, because it was simply natural. It was only afterwards, however, that I took notice of her dress, although my surprise was by no means so overpowering a degree as such an apparition might naturally be expected to excite. Seeing, however, as I suppose, some astonishment in my countenance, she came forward within a yard of me and said, in a voice that strangely recalled a sensation of twilight and reedy river banks and a low wind, even in this deathly room, Anodos, you never saw such a little creature before, did you? No, said I, and indeed I hardly believe I do now. Ah, that is always the way with you men. You believe nothing the first time, and it is foolish enough to let mere repetition convince you of what you consider in itself unbelievable. I am not going to argue with you, however, but to grant you a wish. Here I could not help interrupting her with the foolish speech, of which, however, I had no cause to repent. How can such a very little creature as you grant or refuse anything? Is that all the philosophy you have gained in 1 and 20 years? Said she. Form is much, but size is nothing. It is a mere matter of relation. I suppose your 6 foot lordship does not feel altogether insignificant, though to others you do look small beside your Uncle Ralph, who rises above you a great half-foot at least. But size is of so little consequence with old me that I may as well accommodate myself to your foolish prejudices. So saying, she leapt from the desk to the floor, where she stood a tall, gracious lady, with pale face and large blue eyes. Her dark hair flowed behind, wavy but uncurled, down to her waist, and against it her form stood clear in its robe of white. Now, said she, you will believe me. Overcome with the presence of a beauty which I could now perceive, and drawn towards her by an attraction irresistible as incomprehensible, I suppose I stretched out my arms toward her, for she drew back a step or two and said, Foolish boy, if you could touch me, I should hurt you. Besides, I was 237 years old last Midsummer Eve, and a man must not fall in love with his grandmother, you know. But you are not my grandmother, said I. How do you know that? She retorted. I dare say you know something of your great grandfathers, a good deal farther back than that, but you know very little about your great grandmothers on either side. Now to the point. Your little sister was reading a fairy tale to you last night. She was. When she had finished, she said, as she closed the book, Is there a fairy country, brother? You replied with a sigh, I suppose there is, if one could find the way into it. I did, but I meant something quite different from what you seem to think. Never mind what I seem to think. You shall find the way into fairyland tomorrow. Now look into my eyes. Eagerly, I did so. They filled me with an unknown longing. I remembered somehow that my mother died when I was a baby. I looked deeper and deeper till they spread around me like seas, and I sank in their waters. I forgot all the rest, till I found myself at the window, whose gloomy curtains were withdrawn, and where I stood gazing on a whole heaven of stars, small and sparkling in the moonlight. Below lay a sea, still as death and hoary in the moon, sweeping into bays and around capes and islands, away, away, I knew not whither. Alas, it was no sea, but a low bog, burnished by the moon. Surely there is such a sea somewhere, said I to myself. A low, sweet voice beside me replied, In fairyland, Anodos. And here we have the symbols primary symbols of this story. Looking through a window to a bigger world, seeing something mundane, but seeing something grand in it. And the story is full of things that are bigger on the inside. The desk with the tiny, full size fairy queen in it. Fairyland, when he encounters it, seems to be inside his own room. He goes swimming in a pond that is the size of a garden fountain when you're above it, but it's the size of an ocean when you duck your head underneath it. And there's a tower that has a whole country inside it. Of course, you'll recognize the wardrobe and the nature of Aslan's country itself.
Hmm.
Thing, and this is not just a trope that Lewis liked. It's actually important for understanding literature because modern times view the world this way: fantasy, reality, they're separate things. Where classical Christianity, I'm actually going to skip a slide. Classical Christianity has always seen it this way: a
Uh-huh.
hierarchy. That this world is a dim reflection of heaven. Fairyland is a better reflection of heaven. And notice the picture I put of heaven is, of course, the best reflection of heaven that I could manage. And you all recognized what it was instantly because we can't see into heaven. We can only see gradations of reflection of it. The ancient Greeks believed that there was this eternal reality above our physical reality. Um, the eternal reality is only manifested dimly here, like we're at the bottom of an ocean and the light is coming down. This is why earthly justice is never perfect. We know that justice is real because we know earthly justice is imperfect. Think about that paradox. Real justice has to exist for us to say that we have never seen it on earth. Same with a circle. Where do perfect circles exist? We have never seen one, and yet we know what one looks like. Socrates and the Greek philosophers believed there's this eternal reality that we are somehow aware of, and the Christian era comes along and says, yes, and that eternal reality is a person. And so this is the world of medieval literature, of classic literature in general, is this is that medieval times, and indeed every civilization before that, put things into a hierarchy. 2 weeks ago, we talked about the consolation of philosophy. Some Christians were concerned or have been concerned. Why does Boethius talk about philosophy and not about Jesus? Well, he's writing about philosophy and he understands what philosophy is and where she belongs. Philosophy is below theology, and even theology is below knowledge of God himself. And the other arts are below that. Actually, they didn't think of it in a hierarchy. They thought of it more as a circle. There in the center is theology, the queen of the arts. And you have the other 7 liberal arts around her: arithmetic, logic, grammar, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. These were what the medievals considered to be the 7 most important arts. This hierarchical structure is what we have lost in modern times. I showed fantasy and reality here, but the modern era really sees things this way. You've got astronomy, music, arithmetic, grammar, all the things I just mentioned, they're all kind of in a row. Politics, science, religion, they're all like college courses where you can kind of focus on them. None of them's higher than the other. They're all just areas. Modernism separates everything, which is literally diabolical. That's what the word diabolical means. In classical education, we're trying to reclaim that structure that was obvious to them in the Middle Ages. That's why in one of my classes, and you're seeing this even tonight, I'm going to talk not about just this is ostensibly a literature class. I'm talking about history and the history of ideas and the history of educational models and different eras and mythology and child development because all those things are connected. If you understand any one of those things, you're opening a window to the other ones. Now, here's where the rubber really hits the road, with this idea of the hierarchy. Things reflect higher things. This is why, for example, we don't crucify murderers in Christian society. It's not because of the murderer's rights. Arguably, he's given up his rights. It's because a murderer is an image of God. Doing violence to a human being is defacing a picture of God. This is the reason that Christian civilizations everywhere have limited violence and even made warfare civilized. 1,000 knights fighting each other on a battlefield resembles God's nature more than Indian raiding parties slaughtering each other's families. Even war can be a reflection of God's nature. That's how truly his glory shines in things. So how is all this a reading tip? Well, the reason I think that the world doesn't read these old books is that the books reference this specific hierarchy. Or at least you must believe in hierarchy to write a book. Um, we'll get a little bit more into that, but I would argue that a 1984 style linguistic takeover is actually happening. That by taking away the concept of a cosmic hierarchy, they actually make the old books incomprehensible. They don't need to burn them. Notice what I just said about warfare. People today have a hard time understanding that Christian knights were less violent than Native Americans. We have to reclaim the hierarchy. And I think there may be something even more sinister about it, that modernists say they want to destroy hierarchy because they want equality. I don't believe that. I don't believe that for a second. There might be individual voters who do believe this, but I don't think that's what this is about. Modernists want to destroy hierarchy because they want God not to be the highest thing, and they want to create hierarchies without you realizing it. Because I showed you some propaganda, didn't I, just now? Modernism sees this. I should say modernism says this. We know one of these is the highest thing in modernism. Modernism says there's no hierarchy, everything's equal. Well, actually, they put science above all the rest, don't they? That's our number one tool for understanding the world. And what's the number two tool for changing the world? Politics. And below that, everything else is extracurriculars. But if they get you to stop believing in a hierarchy, you can't see that they've established one. And that's why some animals are more equal than others. Do you know this book, Reagan?
Mm-mm. Is
Oh,
that Animal Farm?
yep.
Okay.
Scary, scary book. They destroy the
Yeah, I
idea of
have not read it.
this is the trick that they pull. They destroy the concept of hierarchy so that the animals will be blind to the hierarchy that they've in fact established.
Okay. I've been thinking and believing that concept, but I haven't read the book.
Oh, it's
Very familiar with 1984, though.
it's a hard book to read for different reasons. It's emotionally terrifying. So let's see. Deep reading tips. Remember the hierarchy, or they used to call it an order of reality. This will help you understand the ideas in the old books. This is if I could give you one key for understanding old, dense, quality, challenging literature, it's to know that that author believed in a hierarchy.
Hmm.
But excuse me, still getting over that cold. Um, but the second tip is like unto it. The hierarchy will also open your ears to tougher language. Here's what George MacDonald says that reading actually is. He has a definition for it in this book. Because Anodos, whose name means upward path, finds a fairy library. And because fairy books are perfect, you open them and understand them perfectly. Here's a description of this. One peculiarity of these books, or at least most of those I looked into, I must make a somewhat vain attempt to describe. If the book was one of travels, I found myself the traveler. New lands, fresh experiences, novel customs rose around me. I walked, I discovered, I fought, I suffered, I rejoiced in my success. Was it a history? I was the chief actor therein. I suffered my own blame. I was glad in my own praise. With a fiction, it was the same. Mine was the whole story, for I took the place of the character who was most like myself, and his story was mine. Until grown weary with the life of years condensed in an hour, or arrived at my deathbed, or the end of the volume, I would awake with a sudden bewilderment to the consciousness of my present life, recognizing the walls and roof around me, and finding I joyed or sorrowed only in a book. If the book was a poem, the words disappeared, or took the subordinate position of an accompaniment to the succession of forms and images that rose and vanished with a soundless rhythm and a hidden rhyme. It glowed and flashed the thoughts upon the soul with such a power that the medium disappeared from the consciousness, and it was occupied only with the things themselves. George MacDonald supposes that in fairyland, the books can take your perception right to the top of the hierarchy. You don't see the words in the book, you see the things the book is about. Now, you can only do that with a human book if you have a mind that's been trained for it. And notice he's got some long sentences here. This book has been criticized for having sentences and paragraphs that are too long. Haven't you heard that criticism of great books? Moby Dick, Lord of the Rings, Dante's Inferno. And the complaint is always actually the same. This book goes on, and I don't know what it's saying. And this is reading tip number 2. The big sentences aren't actually big. There are no big sentences. They're just windows into big ideas. And if you don't know that ideas are stacked in a hierarchy, it'll just look like a big sentence. See?
I was going to say, who even notices the sentences are that big? Because you should be reading and absorbing the content,
Yes.
not the sentence length. That's how you know that it's very shallow observation.
Yes. And I think MacDonald is so good at at sucking you into a long sentence that maybe you didn't even notice the punctuation as it went by. That was one reason I showed it to you. He's reading, and as you are reading the stories that Anodos is reading, you forget that it isn't the whole book.
I would even equate it to like reading the Bible as a Christian versus just reading the Bible,
Oh,
right? Like you're either aware and awake and you can understand the scriptures, or you cannot because he has hardened your heart and it's not revealed to you.
it is that. It is that. Yes. And look at that. Reading the scripture is a higher thing than reading these other books. And that's why the reason these books work that way is that scripture works that way. Brilliant.
Well, Tobin, something you said a few minutes ago, I think you were reading from Phantastes. Yes, it was when the lady was talking, the little fairy that got big. And she said, men like you never believe the first time. And that's kind of what Reagan is saying. People just don't want to believe. And before we started tonight, I was talking about another book. Maybe we can finish when we have time for questions at the end. There are so many places in Lewis's stories where somebody just doesn't believe, whether
Well,
it's Lucy coming back and telling the truth where she's been or whatever.
well, C.S. Lewis is sitting there reading this page as a 16-year-old, and for
Yes,
decades he doesn't believe Christianity.
yes.
Yeah, the irony.
It's like, why did you even like the book?
Well, maybe because in retrospect, after thinking about it, he recalled that line and it spoke to him knowing his life thereafter for the next few decades or several decades.
And now we're getting into this question of whether time is real.
Well, remember he loved G.K. Chesterton, and I don't remember a couple others. And he loved all their ideas, but they had that weird Christian thing.
Yeah.
And he didn't
Mm.
accept all that, but he loved their work and he loved their ideas if they just didn't have this Christian thing going on.
Well, because he was a modernist. I just showed that picture of
Yeah.
fantasy and reality. This is what modernists do. Lewis believed that George MacDonald's story and George MacDonald's faith could actually be separated things.
Yeah. That's what that whole book, Defeating Darwinism, is all about. That's the one we're reading right now.
Oh, I bet you could make some good points about Darwin with that.
Yeah.
Yep.
You can't dance between those two dichotomies and then try to blend them and say it's all good.
Darwin did not start the modern era, but he crystallized part of it.
Yeah, he ramped it up.
Take a look at this. How what I told you I'd say what George MacDonald says what reading is. This is the moment where where that was really shown to me. He continues, if it was a book of metaphysics, which is a forgotten word for philosophy, I had scarcely read 2 pages before I seemed to myself to be pondering over a discovered truth and constructing the intellectual machine whereby to communicate the discovery to my fellow man. Have you ever had that? Where you just stop reading and think about how you would explain this idea to someone? With some books, however, of this nature, it seemed rather as if the process was removed yet a great way further back, and I was trying to find the root of a manifestation, the spiritual truth whence a material vision sprang, or to combine 2 propositions, both apparently true, and to find the point in which their invisibly converging lines would unite in one, revealing a truth higher than either and differing from both, though so far from being opposed to either that it was that whence each derived its life and power.
That's really worth rereading. The first time you just think, wow, he's having fairy books come to life, but it's really a lot more than that.
Uh, did you get hung up on the sentence? Do you need to take a minute? This is what reading is. You hear 2 things that are true, and you're trying to find the higher idea that gave birth to both of them. There are 2 stories of golden apples. What's the real idea that's behind that? This is my diagram, but it's like we down in the secular world of time and space, we see true thing and we see true thing, and modernists go, well, that's all that there is. But when we look with the eyes of faith, trying to look up through this misty barrier up to where the higher truth is, that's when we come to understand these 2 true things really. They're both coming from this higher. The truth isn't Atalanta chasing the golden apples, and it isn't Brunhilde challenging men to the contest, there's some kind of higher truth that gave both those stories their power. Well, how do we make this practical? Um, I love knowing about metaphysics and talking about these higher realities, but how do we make it practical when we're reading a tough book? I would argue that remembering this cosmic hierarchy can change your boredom to curiosity. Because saying this book is too hard is literally a dead end. If the book is too hard, then that's that's the end of the story, isn't it? But if you say, I am too untrained to understand this book, now you have an open road because you can change yourself. You can acquire training. Even if it's just rereading the book, you can take a class. You can go to friends, you can go to wise teachers, and they can open this book to you. But you can also do this for yourself by building an intellectual machine to communicate this idea to your fellow man. I should have asked, do you grasp what he means by intellectual machine?
I think he just means build a means in your mind. So it's not like you're building an actual factory equipment, but I feel like this would be, for example, a metaphor or something that you can use to communicate it to somebody else.
A metaphor could be a machine. Isn't it interesting that he calls it a machine? Why? How is an explanation like a machine?
There's an input, there's some form of energy, and then there's an output. So I
Yes.
guess in that regard, it would basically meet the definition of a machine. The only reason I know that is because there's an Elmo episode that my daughter watches right now that has to do with machines. And so it talks about the layman's definition of machine. And yeah.
How about that?
I'm
They can.
actually highly educated by Elmo recently. They go to the farm a lot.
That's great. They had to construct an intellectual machine for explaining machines. And the explanation isn't the thing they explained. The explanation has its own life. It isn't very alive. It's low down the hierarchy, and its purpose was to be a window into these higher things. This is why it's so important that we recognize the hierarchy. You can't even explain anything in a non-hierarchical fashion. If you've ever explained something and you say, well, I'm not explaining it very well, you know what I'm saying. Like my machine wasn't up to the task. The thing itself is better than I'm making it sound. And Anodos tells us this over and over again because he's trying to reproduce these fairy books from his own brain. So this really is the way that seeing this will make your reading. It won't make your reading easy because some books are just challenging, but it will make easy reading now possible. Go get the training you need and understand that there that reading it is possible. Third tip: have to be careful the way I say this. Your perception is your reality. If you can't understand a deep book, you'll never see higher reality. But at the same time, if you don't know there's a higher reality, you won't understand the book that's describing it because your perception is in the way. I told you Anodos stops believing in fairyland while he's there. And here's how it happens. Listen for another Narnia moment here. He's he's in somebody's house and he is drawn toward this closet. I approached and laid my hand on the latch. Then the woman spoke without lifting her head or looking at me. You had better not open that door." This was uttered quite plainly, and she went on with her reading, partly in silence, partly aloud, but both modes seemed equally intended for herself alone. The prohibition, however, only increased my desire to see, and as she took no further notice, I gently opened the door to its full width and looked in. At first I saw nothing worthy of attention. It seemed a common closet, with shelves on each hand, on which stood various little necessities for the humble uses of a cottage. In one corner stood one or two brooms, in another a hatchet and other common tools, showing that it was in use every hour of the day for household purposes. But as I looked, I saw that there were no shelves at the back, and that an empty space went in further, its termination appearing to be a faintly glimmering wall or curtain, somewhat less, however, than the width and height of the doorway where I stood. But as I continued looking for a few seconds toward this faintly luminous limit, my eyes came into true relation with their object. All at once, with such a shiver as when one is suddenly conscious of the presence of another in a room where he has for hours considered himself alone, I saw that the seemingly luminous extremity was a sky, as of night, beheld through the long perspective of a narrow dark passage. Through what, or built of what, I could not tell. As I gazed, I clearly discerned two or three stars glimmering faintly in the distant blue. But suddenly, and as if it had been running fast from a far distance for this very point, and had turned the corner without abating its swiftness, a dark figure sped into and along the passage from the blue opening at the remote end. I started back and shuddered, but kept looking, for I could not help it. On and on it came, with a speedy approach, but delayed arrival, till at last, through the many gradations of approach, it seemed to come within the sphere of myself, rushed up to me, and passed me into the cottage. Now, George MacDonald says, with this whole book, that children can see the meaning that is behind the physical world. A child looks into a dark closet and says there's a monster in there. And they're right. Not that there are monsters in closets, but there are monsters working in the shadowy places of society, in the dark closets of the human heart. We say there aren't monsters in closets, but we don't understand what the child is even saying. Like another man in Phantastes who keeps getting the fairy tales wrong. Because a closet is more than just a closet. It's a reflection of a bigger idea. And growing up should mean that you realize monsters do live in closets, just not that kind of closet. And this dark figure is a monster of unbelief that runs up and attaches itself to Anodos in the form of a shadow. Monster of unbelief lives in the dark closet, some dark closet in your mind. Fairyland is full of perceptions that, oh, I had a picture of the shadow. Fairyland is full of perceptions that an adult would explain away, like flowers with little people in them, a tree that looks like it has a face. After this shadow from the closet sticks to Anodos, he starts explaining things away. Here's a little snippet. Once as I passed by a cottage, there came out a lovely fairy child with two wondrous toys, one in each hand. The first was the tube through which the poet is looking when he beholds the same thing everywhere. Had you even realized poets behold the same thing everywhere? When you're in love with someone, you see that person everywhere. MacDonald said that's a tube that poets look through. And it actually exists in fairyland. That gift of the poets is a physical thing there. The other toy was that through which he looks when he combines images of beauty which he gathered from all regions where he has traveled into new forms of loveliness. Round the child's head was an aura of emanating rays. As I looked at him in wonder and delight, round crept from behind me that something dark, and the child stood in my shadow. Straightway he was a commonplace boy, with a rough, broad-brimmed straw hat, through which brim the sun shone from behind. The toys he carried were a magnifying glass and a kaleidoscope. I sighed and departed. It's not a halo, it's just a hat with the sun shining on it. It's not a tube for seeing new kinds of beauty, it's just a kaleidoscope. This is funny because C.S. Lewis himself was reluctant to admit that the book he loved was an actual Christian book. He told himself George MacDonald's Christianity wasn't really part of the story. He finally realized later that what he loved about this book is really what should be loved about holiness, just as what we love about Aslan should be what we really should love about Christ. And as Anodos stops believing in fairyland, he even congratulates himself. He says, I might live in a desert where everything is dull and commonplace, but at least I know where I live. He's like a reverse Puddleglum. My senses show me what does Rose, what does Puddleglum say about living in a dark and dreary world?
At least there isn't any rain in the cave. At least. So this is not reverse Puddleglum. It is Puddleglum. Puddleglum is both expecting the worst and hoping for the best, seeing the worst and seeing the best, but he sounds very glum because he is open to both sides instead of one.
That is true. But what does he say when the witch has convinced them that there is no fairyland? Only in that book, she's convincing them that there is no Narnia.
I think he was saying that he'd rather believe in a Narnia than in her sort of world.
I'd rather just search for it forever.
Oh yeah, he doesn't know the sun.
Then,
That's right, because
yeah.
it was the sun. He'd rather there was not a sun that he was still looking for than live in a world with no sun, right?
Right. If there is no sun, still go looking for it.
Right before that conversation, you were just now talking about the man who said it was just a kaleidoscope, it was just a whatever. And the green lady, there's no such thing as a lion, it's just a cat. There's no such thing as sun, it's just a lantern, which is that I can't think of the word of it. It's where you make less of something than what it really is. I can't think of the word. But that's what she's all about. And it's bothering me that I can't think of it. So
Deconstructionism?
No, that's where I went to, but that's not the word I'm thinking of. We just talked about this 3 weeks ago, but he's the one that Puddleglum says, I'd rather have 3 babies have made a better world than beats all your world all to pieces.
Go ahead, Rose.
But the thing is, a kaleidoscope and a magnifying glass. What is the difference between them and the tube through which the poet looks and the other thing he was supposed to be holding?
Right. There isn't
And what's the difference between a halo and sunshine?
The difference is a tired old grown-up is looking at the magnifying glass and the dusty hat and the plain kaleidoscope. The difference is who you
Perception.
are, right? You're exactly right, Rose. Perception. And we get this, we get this all through Lewis's work.
Okay, go ahead.
One of you brought up something. Oh, yes. The Green Lady believes in the hierarchy, doesn't she? She just says that the bottom part of it is what's real. You've seen a lantern, and so you imagined up here there's a bigger lantern. And the Narnians say, no, there's the real lantern is up here, and from that we modeled our lanterns. And actually, even above the sun is God the Father, who is all light. Right? That's what the Christians believe is the hierarchy goes down and kind of gets murkier and murkier as it gets down. And modernists believe the hierarchy starts here and it gets more and more it gets less and less worthwhile the farther you go up. Go ahead, Clara.
So the kaleidoscope secretly is for making new beauties because it makes the patterns that I was seen before.
It secretly is what he thought it was. You're exactly right.
Why does he think it's disappointing?
Because the shadow came and got on the boy and made him look like a common boy with common toys. That's what the shadow does.
The shadow of disbelief.
It closes your eyes to fairyland, making you think that your eyes were actually opened. And here's another one I like to point out because it is my fate. This is more of a Tolkien thing, but The Return of the King. I'll point this out because my daughters are here. The children wait for their fathers to come home from work because it's exciting, and maybe if there was injustice during the day, the father is going to be here to set things right. And this is all throughout literature, that the princes of Ithaca have come to Odysseus's house to slaughter his pigs and terrorize his servants and insist that his wife marry one of them. And the servants are waiting for the king to come home, because when he comes home, everything will be set right. This is why the final volume of Lord of the Rings is called Return of the King. This is why we wait for King Arthur to wake up when the English people need him the most. This is in our mythology and our literature all throughout. And modernists believe, oh, when you were a child, you anticipated your father coming home the day. And now that you're an adult, you hope that Christ will return to save you because you want that feeling again. Christians say, no, you've got it backwards. Christ is coming again. That's why your father coming home is exciting. He's a reflection of the bigger reality. And in the Odyssey, he comes with no comeliness that we should desire him. And the foolish and the unrighteous do not recognize him until it's too late. Really, best part of the Odyssey there. But Anados gets healed from his disbelief, and he gets healed anytime he looks at the face of a child. He suddenly believes in fairyland again. And when he weeps for his own sin, through his tears, he can see fairyland again. Perception doesn't create reality, but it certainly defines your reality. That's why my third reading tip is to perceive like a child, which might sound counterintuitive for books that are challenging. How do you perceive high school and college level books? Well, read them like a child. McDonald has Phantastes has this whole part about mirrors. And he says, when you look at a room that you've seen hundreds of times, when you look at it in a mirror, suddenly the room appears to be a magical, mysterious place. Well, that's because it is. That's not just a perception. That is truth. He says there is no cheating in the unthought sensations of the soul. 2 stories about golden apples? Well, they should be stories. It's not an accident. Your first thought was, this is how it is. When we see a knight and we think he's an ideal man, that's because knighthood is actually the ideal of men. Our culture wants to explain that away and say that all of history's heroes are secretly oppressors. You've seen movies like that where the superhero is a smug narcissist and it's really the villain who's an okay guy. Our culture says that knighthood is just made up by European culture. Well, that's not the point, is it? Knighthood is the way that Europe reflected the ideal. It's our word for what a man is. But just because there are other words for it in other cultures, it doesn't change what a man is. He is a knight, or he's not a man. Talked about with Consolation of Philosophy how if you don't reflect the higher things, you actually cease existing. So that's why my third tip is to become like a little child. Phantastes is a fairy tale for men and women. That's the subtitle. It actually says fairy romance. That's an old-fashioned word for fairy tale. We've lost something, haven't we? We 1984'd that word by calling it a fairy tale. But I kind of had to call it a fairy tale because if I said a fairy romance, you would think it was about two people falling in love. It's more than that. MacDonald gave us a fairy tale for men and women, and that he meant that as a paradox. And what it gives us is the deep wisdom of a child as an answer for the adult longings and shame and despair and emptiness. Here's what he says: I know that good is coming to me. That good is always coming, though few have the simplicity and the courage to believe it at all times. What we call evil is the best shape which for the person and his condition at the time could be assumed by the best good. Children know that this present suffering will pass away. And this is what he leaves us with. So those are my 3 tips. Thoughts and questions?
I'd say you agree. She agrees with the thing about the children know that little things will be better.
Mhm.
Which is funny because things hurt for longer when you are a child. You would think that children would not know that present suffering will pass, but they seem to know it better than grown-ups do.
Well, I don't know how that works. It's just certain things you have to be sure of.
Yeah.
And that, I don't know. Hard to explain. Very hard to explain.
I guess it's childlike faith, huh?
Mm-hmm.
We're supposed to have childlike faith, but unfortunately, the world wants to oppress everything.
Yeah.
You're talking about reading deeper tonight. It's kind of your main
Mm-hmm.
thing. You're just using Phantastes as a vehicle to talk about that. But I think that um, as we're raising our children, we can start them on that path by talking about not only the books that we read to them, but if I can dare put my toe in the movie world, some of the things that you said tonight, I kept thinking about, and I hope it's okay to bring this up, but Robert Duvall passed away recently. He's 100 and something. Do y'all know who that is?
Mm-hmm.
Can I share my screen for a second? I'm going to show you a picture of him so you know who this is because you have to get this movie. You gotta watch this movie. This movie is called Secondhand Lions.
Yeah.
And I hope, can you see that? I don't know if it's showing. I have to hit.
No.
No, it's not.
Oh, is
Oh,
it
there it
showing?
is.
Starting.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there he is, and he and Michael Caine. This is one of the most incredible movies I've ever watched, and you just have to watch it. But I'm going to tell you about a speech that he gives in there. There's three punks that come in a deli general store type place, and they're taking the burgers of the old men. They're just acting up really bad, and he says to them, these kids don't know who these two men are and how they fought in World War I, and they are tough guys. They're old, but they are tough, and they about tear these four teens apart. And Robert Duvall gives them a speech right in their face. He says, sometimes the things that may or may not be true are the things a man needs to believe in the most. And that's kind of what Tobin's talking about tonight, I think. That people are basically good, that honor, courage, and virtues mean something, that power and money and power mean nothing, that good always triumphs over evil. And I want you to remember this, that love, true love, never dies. It doesn't matter if any of this is true or not. You see, a man should believe in these things because these are the things worth believing in. That's one of the most incredible speeches I have ever heard in a film. And when he passed away that day, they were playing this everywhere. It was all over Facebook. It was everywhere. This one speech of his. He made so many wonderful movies, but it's a lesson for life that sometimes, a kid that grows up in a really terrible home where he's not really loved, we would want him to know these things are true, even if you didn't ever experience it. It wasn't your perception, like you were saying, Tobin. It wasn't that kid's perception of his life, but it is the truth,
Yeah.
and it's worth believing in.
What do you think, Tim? Do you agree with that speech?
Mm-hmm. Although yeah, as far as it goes, he's not writing a whole work on metaphysics. Those things are true, but they do not appear to be true.
Yeah.
And probably hadn't been true for the four punks he's beating up. They're like 18-year-old
Yeah.
punks. But you challenged me to read this book again. Um, I happen to have a copy that has Lewis's foreword, and he says in here that he's pretty sure everything he's ever written quotes something from Phantastes,
Mm.
or mimics, or echoes, or connects in some way. And I'm thinking of so many just as you're talking tonight.
Reading that book makes me think so much of Louise. I know she would love it.
Of Louisa, your sister?
Yes.
Yeah, she probably would. We can try to reach people for Christ with books like this. I was thinking about that, thinking about her with this book.
Oh, I could stop sharing. My goodness, I'm sorry.
Somebody shared, yeah, somebody's sharing whether Atalanta secretly wanted the prince to win. That's interesting, but
Mhm.
it's like that's a way we would make sense of it down in the real world. The way the myth was told was just stripped of any detail like that. It's like people in myths don't really have feelings. That's why the myths are eternal, is nobody can marry this girl until he can defeat her in a foot race. And so he uses these apples and then they get married. And you're not supposed to, you don't have to feel like she was forced into it or like she wanted to get married. This is just how the story is. It happens in an ideal form. And that's one of the powers of fairyland. Things are very uncomplex. It's like there's no psychology inside the people there.
Mm-hmm.
So, in I think my favorite version of Atalanta's story is, at least after the marriage, it says they really do love each other, and then Zeus thinks they don't respect him enough because giving all these sacrifices up to Aphrodite for bringing them together, and then they get turned into a pair of lions and just go running about the woods for the rest of their lives.
That's the perfect ending for them, though, isn't it? Because they're hunters. Maybe that's what they always were.